We're back for lecture number 2 of week number 4, and our first lecture focused on the political and social effects of the Industrial Revolution. We're mostly looking at European political and social effects. We're going to shift our focus in the second lecture to look at the global North and the global South. What does it mean when scholars talk about the global North and the global South? And then to link it specifically back to this chapter's readings, did the Industrial Revolution create these different zones? And if so, what are the effects of them? I want to take a moment to just rewind and go back to Karl Marx for a moment because he's so important to understanding this next, or at least the philosophical background behind what I'm going to present to you in this second lecture. But Marx, when he sits down to write the Communist Manifesto in 1848, it's definitely his most famous piece of literature, but it's not necessarily the best at understanding Marx's political philosophy, because Marx's Communist Manifesto of 1848 is replying to a specific event. He had witnessed the failure of the revolutions of 1848, and there's a bunch of them, and they're all very different, but they're all interconnected. They span pretty much the entire European continent. There's a revolution in Tipperary in Ireland. There's revolution in throughout the Italian peninsula in the different Italian city-states. There's also a major revolution in Austria. And these different revolutions are all different. They're nationalist, right? They're trying to overthrow or reform, not necessarily overthrow, but reform the monarchies in which the people live. They want to develop more constitutional monarchies, right? Create parliaments, create legislators that are responsive to the people rather than living in old, outdated, absolute monarchies. And Marx witnesses these, and he recognizes that a lot of the frustration that the people are dealing with comes because they are a subjugated people, right? That they're largely working class, although the leaders of a lot of these revolutions were bourgeois, because they were upper class and they were not titled nobility, but they were becoming more powerful. The leaders might have been bourgeois, but a lot of the workers who strike in Paris or who strike in what becomes Germany or in Austria, these are proletariat. They're working class people. But for the most part, all of these revolutions that Marx is witnessing are unsuccessful, at least in their most radical ideologies and their most radical wants. And so Marx asks himself in the Communist Manifesto, why is this? Why did these different revolutions fail? And the answer he comes to is actually a quite simple one. It failed because they were disunited, right? The revolution that happened in Austria was different than the ones that happened in the Italian peninsula, different than the one in France, different than the one in Tipperary in Ireland. And so he says to himself, the reason that these were all so different is because the proletariat, the working class people, even though they all want the same things, they see themselves as different, right? Austrians saw themselves different as Germans, who saw themselves different from Italians. They had different religions, Protestant versus Catholic. They also saw themselves as different race. Working class British people saw themselves as an entirely different race than working class Irish people. And this is something we'll talk a little bit more about next week when we're talking about the second wave of imperialism. But Marx basically says, workers of the world, unite, right? This is his ultimate call, that they have nothing to lose but their chains if they recognize that workers, whether they be Chinese workers, whether they be British workers, American workers, South American workers, they're all the same, right? They all operate in the exact same exploitative system. But he also recognizes that that's probably not going to happen. The social constructs of race, the social constructs of religion are all a little bit too cemented in society to have a real proletariat revolution. And so in the primary source, I'm asking you to read an excerpt from Marx's Communist Manifesto. And the thing you have to remember, it's always very hard to teach in the United States, is that Karl Marx is writing in 1848. He's writing, more than 50 years before the revolution in Russia that creates the Soviet Revolution. In fact, as I note in the primary source response, Marx would have never thought that Marxism would take hold in Russia. It didn't make sense to him. Marxism only worked in his ideology in dense urban centers. He thought maybe Paris, or perhaps London, maybe New York. But desolate and kind of rural Russia didn't really make any sense to him. And also, the revolution that takes place in Russia that creates the Soviet Union, that then goes on to spark communist China, these were very different than the societies that Marx envisioned. A dictatorship is nowhere referenced in the Communist Manifesto. This is not the society that Marx would have wanted to create. He's dead by the time that these revolutions begin. So when you read Marx, you have to kind of erase your mind of the red propaganda that was created in the United States during the 1950s and the McCarthy trials, right? We're not talking about communism, right, in its Russian or USSR sense. We're talking about Marxism as described by Karl Marx himself. So try to keep a clear mind when you're reading those pieces. And this is something that's mentioned in the documentary as well, after, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, had really industrialized by the 1840s, you see the spread of industrialization onto the European continent, right? Large areas of the Low Countries, today the Netherlands and Belgium, will industrialize. Regions of northern France, especially the coal mining regions of northern and then central and southern France as well, are going to industrialize. You'll have large parts of northern Italy, right along the border with Switzerland, industrialized. Significant regions of what becomes Germany in the 1860s will industrialize. Also in Warsaw in Russia will industrialize as well. But you'll notice from this map that industrialization is not even spread throughout Europe. The most portions by percentage of Great Britain are industrialized, but only like small fragments of France are going to industrialize, a little bit more than France and Germany. But you'll notice from this map that industrialization in Europe was not evenly spread across the continent, and it also came in waves. It wasn't until 40 years after the Industrial Revolution was complete in Great Britain that any part of Russia began to industrialize. And so that's kind of fascinating to think about. But what about when we talk about global industrialization? Well, here we actually enter into a really important and I think very interesting historical debate about the global origins of capitalism. Now, if you watch lecture number 1, I pretty much described the growth of capitalism, the birth of capitalism, as directly connected to the growth of the Industrial Revolution. But there are historians who would totally refute that and say, no, he's wrong. Actually, capitalism is much, much older than the Industrial Revolution. They'll trace capitalism's real rise to the growth of colonization, right? Think back to what we talked about in week number 2. Colonization really gave rise to capitalism, and let's just look at it in terms of cotton and sugar. Both cotton and sugar are grown on plantations. They're harvested after abolition by workers, prior to abolition by slaves. They're refined into finished materials, whether they be textiles, right, clothing, or into pure cane sugar that is then sold back to workers. And so you can see that in the colonial cycle, there's the exact same connection between workers producing and workers consuming that defined capitalism in the Industrial Revolution that can trace itself back to the colonial era. And so, we enter a debate about, is the Industrial Revolution older than we think it is? Did it actually begin long before the first factories were built? People who look at the United States during its industrial period of the 19th century often talk about the alliance of the lash and the loom. In most American classrooms, we say, hey, the North didn't have slavery and the South did. But that's entirely misleading. There may have not been slaves in the North, but the factories that drove up in the North, almost all of them were producing the same thing. Textile, cloth. If anyone's ever been to Lowell, Massachusetts, and anyone follows minor league baseball, you'd know of the Lowell Spinners, right? The spinners, these looms that were creating textile, that created the Industrial Revolution in the United States, were directly connected to the slave plantations of the American South that were producing the cotton. Here in Columbia, South Carolina, actually, it's very obvious to see that. If you go over to the Granby Mills, you'll know that these Granby Mills used to be producing cotton, right? Used to be producing cloth, textile. These were attempts by Northerners to say, hey, we can really cut down on the transportation costs if we take our mills out of the North and move them down to the South. And this didn't happen until right before the Civil War and a little bit afterwards. And then by then, cotton had changed. It had been moved from the American South to Pakistan and to India. But what happens then when the Industrial Revolution goes global like this? I pulled this chart from your textbook because it's absolutely fascinating. Look at the total manufacturing output of the world in 1750. You'll notice that Europe as a whole accounts for a little bit less than a quarter of the entire world's global production, manufacturing production in 1750, right? Just about a quarter, which makes sense because probably slightly less than a quarter of the world's population lived in Europe at the time. The rest of the world was producing the other 3/4, right, of the entire world's production in 1750. Fast forward to 1900. By 1900, Europe as a whole is producing 62% of all the world's manufacturing. The rest of the world only producing 11, with the United States producing 23.6% at this period. So combined, if you take Europe and the United States, you're accounting for almost the entire production of all manufacturing in the world. So this is rather staggering, right? In a course of only 150 years, the rest of the world goes from producing nearly 3/4 of all the world's manufacturing to just 11%. And that is a massive change that creates a new world global economy, right? These other places in the world, whether they be Southeast Asia, whether they be the Middle East, Latin and South America, people lived there and products were grown there, very important products for the Industrial Revolution. However, all of these products were basically taken from these regions and brought back to industrial centers, right? On this slide I've got for you, starting in 1823, straight through the turn of the 19th century, and then a picture that shows you a little bit about U.S. intervention in the 20th century, right? The industrialized world took it upon itself, right in the heart of the Industrial Revolution, to secure the production of raw materials in developing nations and to secure the increasing sale of these finished materials to industrializing nations, right? 1823, the United States issues the Monroe Doctrine, which closes the Americas to any more European colonization. However, the United States is free to interfere in the rest of the Americas. The Mexican-American War of the 1840s seized 1/3 of Mexican land for the United States. Between 1839 and 1860, the Opium Wars, where China, the British Navy, really subjugates all Chinese ports along its eastern coast so that they can continue to import opium from Pakistan and India and sell it to the Chinese people, which was making them a fortune. 1858 to 1947, the British control India and the Raj and continue to market British products to Indians while taking Indian-grown tea and selling it back to their own people in the British Isles. The scramble for Africa, and we're going to look at this entirely in week number 5, so I won't go into it too much. But by 1914, Europeans controlled 90% of the African continent. The French conquest of Indochina that began in 1887. The Spanish-American War, where the U.S. seizes Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Right? All of these instances are examples of the industrialized world securing control of raw materials and markets in the developing world. Right? The global Industrial Revolution doesn't look like the Industrial Revolution in England or in the United States. It looks very much different. But it doesn't mean that the industrialization process didn't happen in nations that we don't consider industrialized today. And this leads me, and I've got 3 definitions here, to a discussion of the global North and the global South. Right? By global North, we mostly mean the industrialized nations. And by global South, we mostly mean the nations that were never industrialized the same way, and rather were exploited for the continuing industrialization and market growth of the global North. And so this is a really important outcome of the global Industrial Revolution, right? You don't have the same type of Industrial Revolution in continental Africa or South America or even Southeast Asia, right? There's not the large population growth. You don't have the urbanization to the same extent that you have in Europe. But it doesn't mean that the Industrial Revolution didn't happen there, right? Rather, it just happened in more exploitative ways that continued to increase the wealth of the global North. And the third definition of the global South, which is really interesting, is this map shows you like where we can visualize the global South being. But now scholars are starting to say, wait, there's global South even within the global North, right? Global South might refer more to groups of exploited people, mostly workers, than it does to actual territories, right? So, people talk about the global South being people who work for minimum wage in the United States. Are they part of the global South? Well, perhaps, because aren't they exploited in very similar ways to workers from across the world, right? And so this is what I want to kind of leave you with, because it has to do with your weekly response. The Industrial Revolution, we picture that top right picture, these children workers in Britain. That's what we picture. But the Industrial Revolution is ongoing. Aren't sweatshop workers in Southeast Asia the same type of exploited workers as the mill workers in Great Britain? Aren't migrant workers in the United States, many of them who trace their origins back to Latin and South America, aren't these exploited people too? I want you to talk in your response a little bit about this global industrial revolution, drawing connections to my lectures, the documentary, and your readings.